kick it off, or do you want us to just go ahead when you let me know? Yeah.
Well, this is another vendor showcase. We're going to have NWN presenting this showcase. I'm not going to steal any of their thunder, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to these two.
Great. Thank you. Morning, everybody. Morning. So I'm Pat Heinrich. This is Tom Cornwell. We're with NWN, as Chris mentioned, and we're going to talk about the worst case scenario and how we mitigate that. And we heard from the gang earlier. Some of you may have missed it. That first of all, the worst case scenario is not helping customers solve business problems through technology. So, but what we are going to do is, I know many of you may know who NWN is already. We are an infrastructure provider, services, equipment. I have 2 slides to talk about who we are, and then we're going to move right into the meat of the presentation and talk about emergency management, continuity of operations, disaster recovery, business continuity. So really, what we want to do is talk more than just the technology recovery. Sure that we have a room full of technologists here, myself included. And so when we think about disaster recovery from a technology side, often we go to, I need my backup, I need my replication, I need my DR data center, I need to be able to bring up my applications out there, which is important. But if that's not connected to how the business uses those applications in a disaster, if that's not connected to the business operations during that very same disaster, then we have some fraying around how the business is going to consume the services that we're making more resilient and we can stand up in a disaster. So we're going to talk through a lot of that connection and our processes. We've done disaster recovery, business continuity projects and help stand up programs for customers. So first of all, NWN. So we are about 500 people, privately held, 300 million plus in revenue organization. We started as a managed services company. We've done that for 15, almost 20 years now. So that's very much our bread and butter. We're also an infrastructure shop, providing infrastructure, the associated engineering services around a number of partners, VMware, Cisco, EMC, NetApp, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And providing those solutions to customers like yourself. In the Carolinas, about 60+% of our business is in the public sector. So we work very closely with customers like yourselves, perhaps many of you here in the room. But we recently started building out from what was our networking practice, our collaboration practice, our data center practice. We now also have a business consulting practice. So if you didn't grab one of the t-shirts from our booth that said "Talk Nerdy to Me," that's us. So we expect nerdy talk in here, specifically around business consulting. And part of that is how we connect the dots between IT and the business when there's a disaster. And as I already talked through that. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to start with a few definitions, because I think that when we say disaster recovery or business continuity, sometimes people have different definitions. I don't think it's as bad as the number of definitions out there for cloud, but it approaches there. So I'm going to try to level set that a little bit. Talk a little bit about planning for disaster recovery. How do we get started, or frankly, what are some of the false starts we've encountered with customers that are trying to build a disaster recovery plan with the help of their business or government or the folks that serve the public? But the false starts that may be experienced there as we ask the business which applications are important, and they say all of them. How much downtime can you handle? None. We've got to get past that, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to go into some of the processes that we use to engage with customers in building a DR program, DR plan. From an identification of how mature an organization is around this, to some of our strategies for, as I mentioned before, interfacing with the business. What do we do from an evergreening process to keep things up to date? We have done projects and come back 3 years later and found that our disaster recovery plan we helped build with the customer has a lot of dust on it, maybe a couple of cobwebs, and is completely outdated. And frankly, we've started over with them because they knew that was what they needed to do. How do we avoid those situations? And then a bit about, of course, the technology. But we put the technology as one of the last things on here because all of these items about maturity and understanding the business needs help us inform what that right technology is. That, of course, has been our bread and butter at NWN for a long time. We're trying to get in front of that so that we can help our customers make smarter decisions around the technology for disaster recovery. Is there anything that anyone would like to get out of this that I haven't mentioned here? We've done this for a long time, and we'd be happy to make sure that we cover any questions anyone has. All right, well, you're going to take what you're going to get. No, I'm kidding. Please ask questions throughout the presentation as we go through. So, some definitions. So in the public sector, oftentimes disaster recovery and business continuity is referred to as emergency management and continuity of operations. So what do I do in an emergency? And how do I keep my operations or my services that I need to get out to my constituents up and running? And in public sector, I think it's really interesting because for a business, continuity of operations may mean, oh, we can provide essential services, degraded services, even shut down some services that aren't essential. And the same is true in the public sector, except that many of you probably have services that only come on board when there's an emergency, or services that are more important to your constituents when there's an emergency. We worked with a local government in South Carolina, and one of the things that they talked about is close to the coast, hurricanes are a risk. How do they get social benefit checks to their constituents when everything's flooded and the bridges are out or something like that? In that case, those benefit checks are arguably more important for people to get in a disaster. How do they make that happen? How do they make sure the systems are up to be able to distribute those monies to those that may need them the most in that situation? I'm going to use the terms, as I already have, disaster recovery, business continuity, which are somewhat synonymous to this, but I do want to ask a question. Can anyone tell me the difference between disaster recovery and business continuity?
Business continuity.
Please.
I mean, things are just running along as normal. Disaster recovery, something bad has already happened, you have to get back up to business continuity. That's what I would think.
Got it. Go ahead.
Those are
Yeah,
common
yes.
definitions that you frequently hear within the technology space. So a lot of manufacturers use those terms to highlight the difference between different technologies that are used within business continuity and disaster recovery.
Yeah, and but in this context, for this conversation, this is why we wanted to talk about definitions. The way we're going to define this is disaster recovery is specifically about recovering IT and the services IT delivers.
Other way around.
What's
Disaster recovery is focused on IT.
Yes, that's what, the services IT delivers.
Right.
Yeah, the services that IT delivers to IT's customers, the employees. Business continuity is about the whole business. So what services are you offering to your constituents that you need to come up and run? It's arguable that disaster recovery is a subset of business continuity because you need this in order to deliver services to those end customers, to those constituents. But when we talk about, at least in this context, in this room, about disaster recovery, we're going to refer to bringing back up those IT services that help enable the rest of the business to continue to deliver those important services in the event of a disaster. And then we're going to talk a little bit and use the term technology recovery, because in the context of disaster recovery or IT, there's the technology. As I mentioned before, one may have a DR data center replicated to it. Move the VMs, start them up over there. That's all technology recovery. But IT is really more than technology. There's the people, how the people are trained. Another anecdotal example from that same customer out by the coast, local government. Apparently all of their storage engineers lived on the same island where there was only one bridge. If the bridge went out, who was going to make sure that storage stayed up or that the disaster procedures for storage would be executed? something that they had to ask themselves as part of disaster recovery, but in this definition, outside of technology recovery, because it's the people part of IT. Tom, do you want to?
Sure. So along the lines of, we're talking about the sliding scale for, RTOs and recovery time objective, how long can you be without a service, or RPO, recovery point objective, how much data can you afford to lose under crisis. We also want to look at there's different aspects to data protection that we have under different types of scenarios that are very different than what they used to be. Historically, and hence why this last item is here, is historically we didn't have any choices about the technology we use to protect data. You have a big mainframe, you back it up to tape. If you have an incident, whatever that incident is, you find some place to do a restore and you pull the data back off the tape. Today we have a plethora of different ways of protecting data. We can use replication, we can use snapshots, we can mirror, we can replicate transactions, we can do all kinds of things. But we also have different types of needs. The needs are becoming more complex, and so we want to make sure that as we're going through the process, we're thinking about what's the actual need for data protection, and so that we can use the right tools. And in this example, the top left, we're talking about archive. So in an archive situation, what we're looking at is we're talking about data that we're holding on to just in case we need it. So that's a primary copy of data that we're holding on just in case. Whereas when we're looking at backups, that's a secondary copy of data that we're keeping just in case. So both of these are just in case copies. So is it really necessary to be backing up archive? A lot of times we back up archive because that's what we do, we back up data. But if it's already just in case and you're already meeting the requirements for that data, then this becomes extra trouble, with extra risk and extra cost that is unnecessary. So we want to keep that out of it if it's appropriate. Bottom left, now we're talking about a third thing, disaster recovery. So if your data center burns down and is completely gone, that's a different case than the traditional, okay, somebody fat-fingered a table in a database and that one table needs to be brought back. In the disaster recovery context, we're trying to bring back all of the services that are missing. In that context, we have different priorities for what the services look like. An example, I frequently use healthcare just because lives are at stake. It makes a good example. In an operational context for backups, a lot of what we're looking at is if the behemoth EMR system goes down, well, that's the most important application in the hospital as far as what operations go. So it has the highest priority when we're talking about an operational perspective. However, if everything is down, then we're talking about, okay, what are the things we need first because lives are going to be lost? We need blood bank, we need pathology, we need to be able to make sure that people don't die while we're dealing with everything else. So your priorities change. And a lot of that, understanding those differences between archive, operational backups, and the disaster recovery in your environment can be very, very crucial. Another example, the same coastal county that Pat was referring to before, one of the things that we got into was that GIS, it seems like something, well, that's not that big a deal because it's just maps, we'll deal with it later. However, the county's emergency management response plan for if there's a hurricane was very dependent upon GIS because they had engineers going out and photographing the different areas that needed to be cleaned up, and that was going through a system that then cataloged all the information about that picture based upon GPS, and it needed to tie into the GIS system. So if they didn't bring that GIS system back up, then that was going to inhibit the actual county recovery following an incident. So again, making sure that those priorities are understood becomes very crucial.
So we already alluded to this a little bit, but I want to take kind of a step back here and talk about business and technology, or IT. And so what we've got here is a very simple architecture stack, starting with the business. That's where end users, business operations, business continuity processes, customer interactions all happen up here with your end users. We go down a step, we get to the applications, the data. And eventually we get to the infrastructure down here that IT is typically responsible for. So IT may not own the data that Tom talked about, but in IT we're often the custodians of that data, making sure it's protected, making sure that it's safe, making sure that one can access it. So down here in IT, the IT stack, technology platforms, alternate infrastructure like DR data centers, data protection, and the technical recovery. That's typically what we own. So business needs come from the business and are translated down to make sure that the technology can support those needs, whereas technical capabilities go up to the business. Well, you say you need something on all the time or something like that. This is what I can deliver with the technology I have, with the resources I have, with the people I have. And oftentimes we see a schism somewhere in the middle that goes a little bit like this. So I've got a conversation of cartoon balloons up here that I'm going to read out. And we've quite literally seen this conversation happen multiple times. And I won't ask anyone if they've run into this. But oftentimes IT goes to the business. IT is usually the ones bringing out the olive branch because they need a DR that's effective for the business. How much downtime can you tolerate on this application, asks IT? None. Exactly. None. Or almost none. Yeah, it has to stay up. And usually, if that person you're talking to uses that app to do their job, regardless of the importance in the greater organization, if I need it for my job, it can't go down. That can get expensive. You sure you want to do that, says IT. What's the response typically? Absolutely. Critical to the business. Got to be up all the time. Not an option here. IT says, okay, if that's what you want, we can do something like that. IT usually goes through some technical, design things, active-active, cluster with synchronous replication, blah, 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 blah. Bottom line to the business, it's going to cost a lot of money. Are you prepared to pay for what you've asked for? Nope.
No.
It can't be that expensive. On your IT, you can find a better way.
Yeah.
And sometimes I've even heard, Amazon doesn't go down. Why can't we just put it in Amazon? It's like, what you don't know could really hurt you. Is what you think.
Yeah.
But you don't say it, right? You don't say it. IT says we'll do what we can. And this is where we get the disconnect. Good. What does IT think walking away? Business doesn't get it. With the equipment and the resources and the people I have, I can do a 4-hour RTO. I'm just going to assume everything needs a 4-hour RTO and move forward. And what's the business think after this conversation? IT's going to figure this out. Can't go down. I expect IT to be able to make sure this app stays up. Everyone walks away. There's peace until the next disaster. The business starts screaming and IT says, well, you didn't tell me what you needed, and we've got a problem here. This is what we tried to fix, is this exact issue. And the way we do that is trying to build consensus. And Tom will talk more about some of the consultative techniques we do that, so we don't ever ask the question, for example, how much downtime can you tolerate? Because we know what the answer is going to be to that question. So we ask indirect questions to get there that we'll talk about. But if we peel back even more, talk about what a disaster even is. Because I think that this even gets, sometimes there's a lack of agreement or understanding between IT and the business as to what we're even talking about when we talk about a disaster. So this is a generic graph of business capability versus time. And so during normal operations here, business capability goes up and down. A server goes down in the VM cluster, I lose a little bit of capability, but I'm still up and functioning just fine. Someone calls in sick, I upgrade something, my business capability goes up and so forth. So that's the normal operations of business. Until an incident occurs. And what happens to our capability? Data center burns down, generator fails to kick in, big storm, what have you. Business capability goes down. And it goes down to an unacceptable level. When we declare a disaster, well, let me stop here and say, these two dotted lines show the acceptable business capability. This isn't normal operation, but this is where we've really got to understand from the business. What's acceptable when we lose things, when we're in a disaster? Where do we need to get to so that we can function as a government, as an organization, and deliver those services? And that is not typically normal operations. For example, if the data center burned down and we wanted to get back to normal, it may take us 6 months. It may take us a year. We may be rebuilding physical buildings. That's not where we need to be. That's not the conversation we need to have with the business, because we want to get to acceptable business capability, and only the business can tell us that. And they're only going to tell us that if we ask the right questions. So as we come back up, in recovery, we get to acceptable business capability and we have recovered. That's different from restoration, which could go out 6 months, a year if we're building a brand new data center. So the emergency response here to the disaster or incident, the recovery to get to acceptable business capability, and then restoration to get back to normal operations. If the business is not talking about or understanding the difference between recovery in a disaster and restoration to normal operations, we're going to have a difficult conversation, because that's when restoration is the app is back up, everything is just like normal. We're asking about recovery from an IT perspective when we talk about disaster. Big difference, very important to pull those apart when we talk to the business.
Another part that frequently gets overlooked is this emergency response phase. Okay, something's happened, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to push the big red button, or are we going to try to fix it on the fly? What's going to happen there? A lot of that issue, the way the technology is today, that's become the easy part. Once we understand the bookends of the response as well as the restoration and what the business is requesting, then finding technology pieces to plug in to meet those requirements becomes the easy part. An example of the emergency response part that gets where problems can come in, and some of you may be aware of this, but over the past couple of years there was an incident where a call center went down for 6 hours due to a bad switch. So an entire call center shouldn't be down for 6 hours, especially when you look at the fact that this call center was configured to be fully redundant and be able to fail over in seconds. Once they recognized there was an issue, they did just that. But it took them 6 hours to recognize the problem, and that was a call center supporting 911 in 11 different states. And that's a big deal. So if you neglect those details, that's where you can get into trouble. But if you get them clear and laid out on the table, then the technology falls out.
So drilling down, if we're thinking about developing a business disaster recovery plan, a disaster recovery program, or even looking at an existing plan, make sure it's up to date and protecting us from what we want to protect ourselves from. At the end of the day, what is disaster recovery planning and building a program about? It's about risk mitigation. So one of the first questions to ask is, what are you protecting yourself from? So that changes the response, the plans, and you may want to protect yourself from a number of things, but where do you start? You start with what? Is that a hurricane if you're on the coast? Is it a pandemic? And I don't just mean the zombie apocalypse, because as it turns out, the processes and procedures from a disaster point of view for pandemic are very similar to inclement weather. If there's an ice storm, nobody comes to work. If there's a pandemic, everyone's locked up in their homes, nobody comes to work. Very similar. Civil unrest. We're in North Carolina. I didn't think this could happen here. We all know what happened recently in Charlotte, and regardless of anyone's political viewpoint here, that has become something very real that we may need to prepare ourselves for here. What services do our end users provide during these disasters? What are those critical services? Emergency services. We talked about payroll, social benefits. How do people get paid? If there's a 2-week disaster, 3-week disaster, are people going to get their paychecks? Are they going to come into work and help get through the disaster if they aren't getting paid? Real questions. Customer support. What do our end customers, our constituents, need from us? Once we know what those are, again, that's the business again, talking to the business to identify those. Then what IT services support that? Do we need telecom up and up quickly because it's a critical communications tool? You have to ask the business. What applications do we need up? What kind of access? Running our VMs maybe in a different data center, something like that. How do those end users in our organization access that? A little story about telecom. We're at a hospital. We found out interviewing a lot of the lines of business in the hospital that they go to telephone as their primary communications tool in the event of a disaster or an emergency. However, Digging a little deeper, big hospital building, there are places at the bottom of the building with no cell phone signal. So, or actually, they said if the phones go down, they rely on cell phones, and they issue cell phones. They have banks of them in some departments. But there's no cell phone signal in parts of the building. It's okay. IT's got repeaters they put up in the ceiling in these places. Great. Except that, talking to IT, we found out those aren't on generator power. Power goes out, there's no signal to those parts of the hospital. That's where the business built a plan, business continuity plan. Works great according to them. Never talked to IT to see if the resources or the services they depended on were going to be available in the disaster they were trying to protect themselves from. Again, connecting those dots. Any questions so far? Comments? I'm going to turn it over to you for this part.
So when we're looking at disaster recovery and business continuity, we want to highlight the fact that there are lots of frameworks around from which you can start building a program and start planning for disaster recovery. In this example, this is the DRI 10 professional practices. They have numbered these 1 through 10. I want to highlight that's just for identification. This is not a 10-step plan to put in a DR program and then be done. These are just 10 different areas that have to go on in an ongoing manner. It's a cyclical process. But initiation, what we're talking about is making sure that you've got the proper support within the organization to make sure that what you build is going to be successful. You're going to be able to have funding, you're going to have people's time, you're going to have buy-in from the different departments, etc. So we're talking about that. Typically, we're talking about making sure there's a policy at the top that's signed off on by the management board, whoever is responsible within your organization for signing off on policies, so that you can get that leverage to do what you need underneath it. Risk evaluation is along the lines of what Pat was just talking about. What is it we're worried about? We need to make sure that we're going through and protecting from what we need to protect from. Otherwise, we get into examples. I worked with an organization that wanted to have 2 data centers where they could actively just randomly pick an application and move things back and forth. Yeah, we could do that, and they were prepared to pay for it, but it would cost a whole lot of money, and it wouldn't have bought them anything, because there was no scenario that they could come up with where that actually would have provided them any benefit. And in fact, it would cause them harm, because the applications are so intertwined that by randomly moving one application from one site to the other impacted the way that the applications work together. So it actually was a bad idea for them, but they weren't looking at what the risks were that they were trying to protect from. Business impact analysis, BIA. You also may hear terms such as application impact analysis, technology impact analysis. Bottom line, what we're talking about is the partner to the risk assessment piece, the risk evaluation piece, is to understand, okay, the services that we're providing, if everything's gone, what is the priority for recovery, and how long can I afford to be without these things? So, if I have to choose between 2 applications, which one's coming back first, right? So we've got to go through that process. And that's where you get into the challenges of, you can't just ask the business what the requirements are because we know what the answer is going to be. We have to go through a process to have a discussion with them about how they actually use the tools and what they do when they don't have them. Because everybody has different temporary outages. They all occur. What do people do? So we get into that conversation about last time you had an outage, what happened? How bad was it? How much work was it to recover once the system came back up? We go through those types of processes to help figure out what the ranking order should be. Once we understand those requirements, then that's again where we can start coming in and figure out, okay, what are the appropriate strategies for recovery? So in an example where staff may be limited in a disaster, well, you may have a situation where you say, okay, well, let's put our production applications far away, and then we'll have DR data center close to where our staff are, because that way we're not hitting both with the same incident. So if our production gets hit, then our staff is already in place and ready to deal with recovery. Again, it comes back to understanding what the risks are and what the recovery needs are. Once we've built out those strategies, again, we need to make sure we know how to trigger them. Okay, well, what are the consequences for failover? We were talking to a customer relatively recently that had an incident, and they decided to fail over from production to DR. They started that process, and in the middle of the process, the primary issue was resolved, but they were already committed, right? They couldn't just flip the switch and fail back, right? So failover typically is an easy process. Fail back is much more complicated. So you need to understand what are those consequences and how do I make an informed decision as to when I should fail over and when I shouldn't. And then implementation. You've got to understand who's actually going to be doing recoveries, right? What's the audience that we're talking about? Let's have the right level of documentation for those people. The problem is if you get too detailed in your documentation, then it becomes difficult to maintain. However, if it's too ambiguous, then you don't have the skills necessary to be able to recover. So you've got to find that appropriate balance depending on the audience. If it's somebody that knows it very well, then you can keep things at a higher level. If you've got people coming in off the street that know how to read and type, then you've got to have things very, very detailed. It's usually somewhere in the middle we're looking for. And then once you've gotten to that point, you need to make sure people know what their roles are. You've got to be able to validate that the plan does what it's supposed to. When we're talking about exercises, we're not talking about validating that the plan works. We know that the plan works to some degree. We also know that there are cases where it doesn't. What we want to find is where does it not work. So we're trying to break the plan with an exercise. We're not trying to prove it works. And then along those lines, when we talked before, Pat mentioned communications. Crisis communications are different than operational communications. We got to cover that up. And then external agencies. Who are the people that we need to work with that aren't a part of this plan? How do we work with them? So if you're talking about emergency response, how do you deal with FEMA? Have you built out your plan in an ICS structure so that you can work with them if they come in? What about partners that bring in equipment? If you have failures and you need to replace equipment, how do you bring those partners in to get that replacement equipment in? We need to make sure all of that stuff is all tied together. When we go in and start building out a program, like I said, we're not going to do that 1 through 10. For coming in greenfield, one of the things that we want to do is come in and look at where are you now, right? This is a DR program maturity model. It's in kind of an open source model. What we've done is we've taken this model and built a tool for actually going through and doing assessments so that we can do a handful of quick interviews to get a broad perspective on what the organization looks like and how it thinks. Kinds of things that we're trying to get out of here is if you think about if you go into a building and there's a fire, your natural tendency is to walk out the same way you came in. But if you had to wind your way around through the building, there may be a door right beside you that takes you directly outside, but you don't know it unless there's a big red fire sign that says go this way. So we want to understand those kind of, what are the natural processes people have so that we can deal with those. And we're going to look at different areas of leadership, metrics, the program structure. We're also going to look at these 4 different technical areas down at the bottom. Incident management, what happens when something bad happens, how do you deal with it? Technology recovery, we talked before about that, how do we actually make sure the technology is working? Following an incident, business recovery, how do we make sure that the technology is supporting the business the way it's supposed to? And then lastly, security management. We don't want to forget that security plays a crucial role in any incident. Whether that's before or after, or it is the incident itself. These are all disruptive events that all tie together, and the whole program needs to look at all 4 areas. The key to this is that no one wants to be a 1, which means you're breathing, and no one wants to be a 6, which means all you do is business continuity and disaster recovery. Most organizations want to be somewhere in the middle. The way I highlight this is, a farmer grows grapes. This may be the right level of maturity if you're just trying to sell them to the supermarket, but this is the right level of maturity if you're making raisins. And even this, where the grapes have stayed on the vine too long and are frozen, may be the right level if you're trying to make iced wine. So when we go through this process, we want to sit down and discuss where do we want to be, where are we, and how do we get there. So once we've done that, then we can come through and go through the process of actually documenting what are the requirements that we need to have for the program. And then from that process, then develop out what the strategy is. Again, where do we place our data centers? What technology do we need to put in place? What processes do we need to put in place? How do we manage it? What budgeting, etc. And what compliance is going to govern some of the things that we're dealing with. Do we have a mandate to conform to NIST, to ISO, whatever the case is? Let's make sure that we've got the right regulations and standards and frameworks identified so that we can conform. Again, I just kind of listed some of this stuff. When we get into technology recovery, again, we've got lots of tools that we can come and put into place. The main thing that we want to make sure of is that we've got people tied to that. Again, it doesn't matter if you've got this beautiful data center that can completely fail over, 100% to another data center, but then there's no way for users to actually get to that information in those tools.
Let me just add something. So from an NWN perspective, this has been our bread and butter for a long time, building out that infrastructure, helping with that. But not if we haven't done the work up front, then perhaps what we're trying to do is replicate everything. That may be expensive, especially when we talk to the business, we find out there are applications out there that they don't need recovered for 5 days, for 3 weeks, for 4 weeks. Is replication really the right answer? Maybe we just do a backup and we restore that when we have time. Or if it's stateless, like some sort of management or monitoring system or something like that.
Citrix is a good example.
Yeah, like Citrix VDI, for example. We don't need to replicate that. I don't know, because it's stateless. Just have a cold copy somewhere and spin it up. There's no real-time data in there except for the current desktops being used. And if those go down, just move them somewhere else. So we can make more educated decisions around what's the right technology, potentially saving effort, saving money, and simplifying things if we know exactly what is critical to the business, has to come up quickly, and frankly, what isn't.
So as part of the planning process, again, there's some of the things that we talked about, like through the initiation, having appropriate policy in place, having the right governance structure, how are decisions made, how do things integrate in with change management. I mean, that's crucial. IT is changing so fast. Our organizations are changing so fast. If you go out and build a DR plan and it doesn't have these pieces in place, it's going to be outdated as soon as it's finished. So we can't have that happen. I mean, that's really an unacceptable situation. So we have to start with putting these tools into place, again, to make sure that as soon as it's rolling out, it's already being updated. The procedures themselves actually become a secondary thing. A lot of times the procedure information, again, depending upon the target audience for your procedures, which seems trivial but isn't, a lot of times the stuff that you're putting in there may be things like license keys, IP addresses, server names, things like that. That actually becomes the most important information because the process you should already be practicing, you should already know. So having the process itself as part of those procedures is important, but it frequently is less important than a lot of this other information. Other things may also be, how do you know that the application's working once you brought it back up online? Who are you going to contact? How are you going to reach them? How are they going to then determine that all the data is good and clean and doesn't need any work done to it and the application is functioning properly? And then when we roll into maintenance, auditors are typically your friend when you're going through this process. It seems contrary, but they're the ones that are going to be dinging you if you mess it up. So let's go ahead and get them involved in the process and make sure that they're going to be coming through and know what the types of things that they're going to be looking for. Change management, as I said, we have to have that in place. That is absolutely crucial so that as things change in your environment, and that's not just the technology, we're not just talking about upgrades or configuration changes, we're also talking about organizational changes. What happens when somebody quits? What happens when somebody gets hired? What happens when the direction of the organization or the mandate to the organization changes? Right? All of these things have to tie into the plan to make sure that the plan is being successful, and then it has to be refreshed on an ongoing basis. And then another very important step is, again, like I said, exercise. We have to go through all these pieces to make sure that number one, the exercise is going to do what we set out to do, and that number two, when we finish, we've got as much information about what can go wrong based upon that scenario as possible. One of the big insurance company that we worked with recently had a situation where they were doing full-blown DR tests twice a year, and they never had a failure in their DR tests. However, they spent 3 months planning out the details and a script of what was going to happen, so they knew exactly what button to push and when to push it and who was going to do it, because it was all written out for them step by step. But when we started digging under the covers, if they had a real disaster, they couldn't have recovered. It would have been impossible because no one knew what to do or even where to start. They didn't know where to go. Where's the start? Step one. They couldn't find it. because all they need to do was to go to the script that was handed out to them in preparation for a staged disaster. And one of the things that I recommend with any exercise is to treat an exercise like a live event. When you're done, document it the same way you would when you're finished, have a post-mortem review, discuss what went right, what went wrong, what you can do better, and then generate a report that's presented out to the business so that everybody knows, this is what we did and this is, how we can do things better, and it sets their expectations better so that they can better integrate in with your plans. Coming back to the example before with the cell phone usage, that gives them the information to come back and say, oh, wait a minute, we have a problem, we need to address this. Some of the tools that we use for building out programs, of course, they're going to be empirical tools where we go in and look at, how big a pipe do we need, how much data storage do we need, how much compute resources do we need. But where a lot of the more challenging areas get into, for example, focused conversations or interviews. Like we're talking about with from a business impact perspective, how long can this application be down? If we're going through and asking that question in a questionnaire, we know what answer we're going to get. It's not terribly helpful. So we have to get into that interactive discussion with individuals to really understand what really is important. And conversely, it helps them to understand if they're being deprioritized, why they're being deprioritized. I had a situation, again, with a hospital where the director of food services was very upset that the system that managed recipes didn't have a 1-hour RTO on it. However, their EMR system only had a 2-hour RTO on it. So why would it make any sense at all to wait 2 hours to build up their big EMR system, but their food services recipes had to be done in an hour? I mean, people can wait an extra hour to eat. That's not that big a deal. But in her mind, that was important because she couldn't function. Other things we do along those same lines, and Pat was mentioning consensus, is different types of workshops. So a lot of times one of the things that we have trouble with when we deal with organizations and we want to overcome is different perceptions of the same thing. And again, like for example, when we were talking about the definitions earlier, people can use the same words but think they mean different things. It's not that anybody's wrong, but the bottom line is if you're sitting there talking the same words, you think you're in total agreement, and you walk away and you have totally different perspectives, then you're set up for failure. So we use different techniques within workshops to make sure that people have the right level set, not only of what the situation is, but also how they work together, what language they're using, what the implications are, and how all these different pieces of information work together. And then lastly, in certain cases, there are cases where we just need to get a broad swath of information, and that's where we use questionnaires and surveys. It's not our go-to for information. Then once we've gotten all these other pieces laid out, that's when we start getting into the architecture and looking at the technology. If our requirements are low enough and we need a small RTO, we can only stand to be down for an hour, but it's going to take 45 minutes just from a technology perspective under ideal perspectives situations to be able to recover in a manual way. Then what happens when things aren't ideal and you don't have the right person? Those things are going to slow down. You don't have the things that you expected. So then putting in automation to do those processes becomes important. Program management. A lot of these moving parts with the different organizations, sub-organizations, different departments within the organization, how do people work together? Making sure all that stuff is coordinated well. There are tools to be able to do that if necessary. That can stem from simple things like building out an internal wiki all the way up to third-party tools that manage workflows within a full program. And data protection, as we said before, what are the right types of data protection? Are we talking about replication? Are we talking about mirroring? Are we replicating the transactions before the data is even written? And what I mean by that is not just the data on the storage side, but are you replicating the information before it even hits the server? So for example, if you have a system that needs very, very low downtime, and I mean really truly zero downtime, then as transactions come into the system, they can be replicated to mirrored systems. So for example, your web server, you got 2 different web servers that receive and process the exact same transaction in parallel. so that they're doing the same things, they're writing the same data all the way down in mirrored infrastructures, so that if one goes down, nothing is lost, right? That's a very expensive mechanism, but if you need it, it's there. So what are those right tools? And we don't want to just put things in because it's what we know, because it might not meet the needs of the requirements, needs of the organization. It may be too expensive or more expensive than it needs to be, I should say. And it may not provide the right level of protection in the right situations. Oops. Any questions?
I have a question as to how disaster recovery relates to IT as a service, because it sounds like you're talking a lot about like operational type stuff, servers and so on.
So that comes back to the very early on when we were talking about the definitions of business continuity and disaster recovery and differences between RTOs and the whether you're talking 1 hour, near zero, 5 days. Really what we want to do when we're looking at disaster recovery is we're looking at what is the technology and how does the business use it. It doesn't matter how it's provided. That is completely irrelevant. That comes in later when we're figuring out how to meet the requirements. It has nothing to do with the requirements. So if you're using Amazon Web Services for everything that you do, what do you do when you can't reach Amazon? Right? Those are still issues that occur. The services still have to be delivered. It doesn't matter how they're delivered in the production maker. As far as what your requirements are, it just changes then, how do you necessarily protect it? So another example, a lot of platform as a service or software as a service type environments, such as a Salesforce, others, a lot of people put full weight into that service and say, okay, well, it's never going to go down. Well, maybe not, but maybe I just can't get to it, right? What are those risks? And so maybe I need to have a way to back up that data on my own premise so that I can access it should something bad happen. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, and I think also, do you have anything as to like backing up with manual processes? Because like Salesforce, for instance, you might need to back that up manually by writing things down or putting stuff in a ledger or
Like
something
going
like
to
that.
paper?
Yeah.
And that brings up a very good issue. And again, that tie between the business and IT, because a lot of times the solution to a business problem, a people problem, is a technology solution, and a lot of times the technology problem has a people solution, so exactly what you're saying. So if you, again, back to a hospital, if the registration system's down, well, that can be written down on paper, and then when the system comes back up, you can plug the paper back in. Conversely, a lot of times a business will say, okay, well, we're going to use virtual desktops to allow users to access systems when they can't get into work, right? So it goes both ways. And again, you've got to sit down and look at that bigger picture of what does the business need to then see how does technology support that requirement.
And I'll add to that at some hospitals we've worked at a number of times, the fallback is pharmacy. Oh, we'll go back to pencil and paper. In the lab, we'll write things down. Number of places, the answer was pencil and paper. But probably about half the departments in one hospital that said that asked, well, where are the printouts, the templates for that? Oh, it's on SharePoint. Like, no. So the question became, how long a disaster do we need to account for? Is it a day? Is it a week? Is it 2 weeks? How many copies of that template do we need? And if we change our processes and our data, who's responsible for updating the template and updating the physical copies? So again, very manual process, and eventually they would enter that back into the systems after the systems were brought back up. But to your point about pencil and paper, absolutely, that's the right way for the business to do something during recovery. But again, conversation with the business and IT to make that determination. Other questions? Comments? Yes?
Yeah. Everybody's got limited budgets, particularly IT folks. What's been your experience on the way some of this gets funded when you go to the businesses?
A lot of times what we see is folks have something of a DR plan Maybe they have technology in place, replication, a DR data center. Maybe the business has, a continuity of operations process, an EOC defined, some of the technology that goes into an EOC, things like that. And so what we often do is start with the maturity analysis that Tom talked about, because it's small. It's usually about 5 interviews of a half hour each. But it lets us level set. What do you have already in place? What do you not? And once we have that, we can also have the dialogue around, here's where you are. Where is it that you want to be? And start figuring out where things fall into place. And that becomes something that is very consumable, we've found, to executives in organizations who often do control priorities and funding, and say, here's a maturity model that says we're here. Is that the right place for us to be as an organization to support our customers and constituents? If not, where do we want to be? And we find that that's a process that seems to open some eyes, especially because if you saw the dashboard that Tom presented, it's very consumable from an executive standpoint. So we've had a lot of success there.
But that comes back to also what I was saying before about if you have an incident or if you have an exercise, make sure you're publishing the results of those. Be very open about what is happening, because it's better to take some, a little hand slap than it is for the business to continue to think that things are great and they're not, because you're never going to get, funding if that, back to that earlier conversation of either they think it's okay or they think it's not that expensive. So you have to have that open dialogue of this is what it costs to remediate these things. These are the ways that we can do it. And as long as you keep that dialogue going, you can continually be told no, but as long as you're communicating what the situation is, that's protecting you and providing them with the information they need to make decisions.
And more of a comment than anything, I would say right now, especially when we have limited budgets and things like this, this is sort of our golden window right here, this opportunity right now, just post Hurricane Matthew, when these conversations are now going on in, I don't know how many boardrooms, management team meetings, or those things. So, this is probably our golden opportunity from an IT perspective to get those things in front of them and say, oh, by the way, you're right, and we think we can give you a solution for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Live public events, whether it happened to you or somebody else, are good times to push for change. Other times are when there's some sort of public attention, whether that's from audit or something else, other event that's going on that brings people's eyes to what the situation is.
Are you seeing any movement from the application providers to provide either duplicate or additional licensing information in order to maintain a standby site and a DR site without paying twice for the
that varies tremendously depending upon the manufacturer.
Like Microsoft wouldn't do that, obviously.
Like I said, it varies widely, but depending upon what the actual needs are, there are different ways of addressing it. So actually sitting down and looking at what the circumstances are and what the challenges are, most of the time we can come up with a solution. But it is coming back to what is that exact requirement before we start figuring out how to deal with it. Yes, sir.
A lot of what the gentleman up here was talking about with licensing can be solved if you look at licensing instead of licensing to a person, license to a machine. So that way, oh, well, this machine's down, well, guess what? We are still technically using our license on our DR machine. So that way we have avoided any kind of licensing issues.
Yeah, a lot of times
it's really on standby. It's already got to be installed on that secondary machine anyway. So, and usage is obviously a factor, but.
Right, and like Tom said, it just depends on the vendor. Some allow that, some are like, oh no, need to be dual licensed. Others, like Microsoft, one of the things they do creatively is if you're in a service provider on the DR side, the service provider licenses work differently and you can be charged by the month over there and things are active, as opposed to having to just have dual licenses in your private data center. So there are options to potentially get creative, but it really is on a case-by-case, software manufacturer by software manufacturer basis. Other questions? All right. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.